Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. Thomas stood at the edge of the forgotten continent, gazing at the endless expanse of dense forest before him. The salty ocean breeze that had accompanied him and his team on their journey now felt distant, as if the very air itself had shifted, growing heavier and more oppressive. His boots sank into the soft, moss-covered ground, the earth here seeming to pulse with an unnatural energy. Behind him, the rest of the team, Elara, Marcus, and Lyra, waited in uneasy silence. They could feel it too. This land, untouched by human hands for centuries, held a power neither natural nor welcoming. "This is it," Thomas said, his voice low but clear. "The place my father sought. The heart of the forgotten continent." Lyra, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon, adjusted the strap of her bow across her shoulder. "The trees are wrong. They're too close together. No natural forest grows like this." Elara stepped forward, her hand extended toward the nearest tree. Her fingers hovered just above the bark, but she pulled back before touching it. "It's not just the trees. The magic here is alive, more alive than it should be. It's like it's watching us." Thomas nodded but kept his gaze forward. His father's journal had warned him about this place. The lost continent, long believed to be a myth, was no simple ruin or unexplored wilderness. It was a land imbued with ancient magic, magic powerful enough to transform the very landscape and the creatures that inhabited it. "Power like this doesn't come without a cost," Marcus said, his tone grim. The seasoned warrior had seen enough in his years of fighting to recognize danger when it loomed. "We're not turning back now," Thomas replied, firm but not unkind. "This is what we came for. We need to understand what happened here, and stop it from spreading." The group pressed forward, their footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. As they moved deeper into the forest, the air grew thicker, almost as if the forest itself was trying to push them away. Strange, shadowed shapes flitted between the trees, always just out of sight, and the sounds of the forest, birdsong, the rustling of leaves, grew distorted, as though heard through water. Hours passed, and the team found themselves standing before a towering stone archway, half buried in the earth and overgrown with vines. Carved into the stone were ancient symbols, unfamiliar and foreboding. "This must be the entrance to the city," Elara said, her voice barely more than a whisper. She stepped forward, running her hand along the carvings. "These markings, they tell of a civilization that once wielded unimaginable power. But there's something else, something darker. A warning." "Let me guess," Marcus grunted. "Don't go in." Elara smiled grimly. "Something like that." But Thomas wasn't deterred. He had come too far to turn back now. His father had given his life searching for this place, and Thomas was determined to finish what he had started. "We have to know what happened here. If we don't, this magic could destroy more than just this continent." The team crossed through the archway, stepping into what remained of the ancient city. Once grand structures, now little more than crumbling stone, stretched out before them, half hidden by the encroaching forest. The air here was different, heavier, darker. It smelled of decay and old magic, the kind that lingered long after its creators were gone. As they explored, the group noticed that the plants and animals were growing stranger. Trees bent at unnatural angles, and the animals seemed to move with a disturbing intelligence, their eyes tracking the humans with unnerving precision. It was as if the creatures themselves had been touched by the same magic that had once ruled this place. "It's not just the buildings that are cursed," Lyra muttered, her bow held ready in her hands. "Everything here has been changed." They ventured deeper into the city, drawn toward its center by a faint, pulsating energy that seemed to call to them. As they approached, Elara stopped, her eyes widening as she pointed toward a massive temple in the distance. "That's it," she said breathlessly. "The source of the magic. I can feel it." The group moved cautiously toward the temple, their senses on high alert. As they drew closer, the ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with life, or something close to it. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the forest faded into an eerie silence. They entered the temple through its broken doors, the interior lit by a dim, unnatural glow emanating from the walls themselves. The carvings inside told the story of the city's downfall. A great civilization, driven by its thirst for power, had tapped into a source of magic so strong that it consumed them, turning them into something else, something monstrous. "This is it," Elara whispered. "This is where it all began. The magic that destroyed them, it's still here." Thomas nodded, his mind racing. His father's journal had hinted at this, an ancient, cursed magic that had the power to transform and corrupt. But what the journal hadn't mentioned was how to stop it. And now, Thomas realized, it wasn't just the ancient civilization that was at risk. The magic was spreading, seeping into the land, corrupting the forest, the animals, and, if they weren't careful, it would consume them too. "We have to stop it," Thomas said, his voice determined. "Before it's too late." Elara nodded. "There's a way. A ritual. But it requires a sacrifice. Someone has to give their life to contain the magic." The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Marcus and Lyra exchanged uneasy glances, but Thomas already knew what had to be done. He had come to this continent to finish what his father had started, and now, he realized, that meant sacrificing himself. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "I'll be the one." "No," Elara said, her voice breaking. "There has to be another way." But Thomas shook his head. "There isn't. My father died trying to stop this magic. I have to finish what he started. It's the only way." The team stood in silence, the weight of Thomas's decision settling over them. Marcus clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "There's got to be another way. We don't even know if this will work." "It will," Elara said softly. "But the cost is real." Lyra, her eyes sharp and fierce, stepped forward. "We'll fight to the end. If this is how it has to be, then we'll make sure it's worth it." Thomas looked at his team, the people who had stood by his side through countless dangers, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had found something here, something more than magic or power. He had found a family. And now, he would give everything to protect them. The ritual began at the temple's heart, the ancient symbols on the floor glowing with a light that grew brighter as Elara chanted the incantation. The ground shook, and the air hummed with energy as the magic gathered, swirling around them in a violent storm of power. Outside, the forest creatures, the twisted remnants of the ancient civilization, sensed the disturbance and surged toward the temple, their monstrous forms moving with unnatural speed. Marcus and Lyra stood at the entrance, weapons ready, prepared to fight off the oncoming horde. Inside, Thomas stood at the center of the ritual circle, his heart pounding in his chest as the magic grew stronger. He could feel it pulling at him, drawing him in, and he knew there was no turning back. With one final word, Elara completed the ritual, and the magic surged into Thomas, filling him with unimaginable power. For a brief moment, he felt everything: the forest, the creatures, the ancient civilization. He understood the curse, the corruption, the madness that had consumed them, and then, it was over. Thomas collapsed to the ground, his body spent, his life force drained. The magic that had once threatened to destroy the continent was sealed, contained within him, forever bound to his sacrifice. The forest fell silent. The creatures, once monstrous and twisted, began to revert to their natural forms, their humanity restored. The air, once thick with magic, grew light and fresh again. Elara knelt beside Thomas, her eyes filled with tears. "You did it," she whispered. "You saved us." Marcus and Lyra approached, their faces grim but grateful. They had won, but the cost had been great. As they left the continent, Thomas's body left behind in the heart of the temple, the team knew that his sacrifice would never be forgotten. He had given everything to save a land that had been lost to time, and in doing so, he had saved them all. Thomas's body lay still in the heart of the temple, bathed in the faint, residual glow of the magic he had just sealed away. Elara, Marcus, and Lyra stood around him in solemn silence. The air felt lighter now, almost peaceful, but the weight of what had just transpired hung over them like a shadow. Elara knelt by Thomas's side, her hand trembling as she touched his cold skin. She wanted to say something, anything, but words failed her. She had seen many lives lost over the years, but this was different. Thomas had not just been a leader, a friend, he had been the one who gave them hope when they had none. And now, because of his sacrifice, they could leave this place alive. Marcus stood stiffly, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword as if bracing for some unseen threat. The old warrior had seen enough death in his life to know that sometimes, the hardest part wasn't the fighting, it was what came afterward. It was the stillness, the quiet that followed the chaos. And in that silence, Marcus felt a profound emptiness. He had fought at Thomas's side for so long, trusting his instincts, relying on his leadership. Now, that trust and loyalty had led them to victory, but it also left a gaping void that Marcus wasn't sure how to fill. Lyra was the first to break the silence. "We need to leave." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a forced calmness that barely masked her sorrow. She had always been pragmatic, the one who focused on survival and strategy. But even she felt the sting of loss. She bent down, gently closing Thomas's eyes, her fingers lingering on his face for just a moment before she rose again. "We owe him that much," she continued, her tone softening. "He did what none of us could. And now, we need to finish this." Elara nodded, though the movement felt heavy, like she was fighting against the weight of her own grief. "I can't believe he's gone." Her words came out as a whisper, almost as if she were afraid to speak them into reality. The truth of it all felt too vast to comprehend. He did it, but at such a cost. Marcus sighed, his expression hardening as he turned toward the temple's entrance. "It's always like this, isn't it? We win, but we lose the one person who made it possible." "No," Lyra said firmly, her gaze sharp. "We didn't lose him. He chose this. He knew the risks, and he went through with it because he believed in what we were doing. He saved this land. He saved us. That's what we need to remember." They stood in the temple for a few more moments, allowing the reality of their situation to sink in before finally stepping away from Thomas's still form. The magic that had once filled the forest and corrupted its creatures was gone now, sealed within the temple, forever bound by the sacrifice of one man. The walk back through the forest was strangely serene. The trees, once twisted and sinister, now seemed to breathe with renewed life. The creatures that had stalked them from the shadows were no longer lurking, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. It was as if the entire forest had been reborn, freed from the curse that had held it captive for so long. Yet, even as the land around them healed, there was no escaping the sense of loss that trailed the group like a specter. Every step felt like it carried the weight of their fallen leader, a reminder of the price that had been paid. They reached the edge of the forest just as the sun began to set, casting the sky in hues of deep orange and purple. For a moment, they simply stood there, looking out at the horizon, the quiet beauty of the scene at odds with the turmoil they felt inside. "Do we just leave him there?" Elara asked quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Marcus glanced back at the forest, then at the distant temple where Thomas's body lay. "It's what he would have wanted. His sacrifice sealed the magic. As long as he rests there, the curse will stay locked away." Lyra nodded, her gaze steady. "He's a part of this land now. He's its guardian." They stood in silence for a moment longer before Lyra spoke again. "We'll make sure his story is told. People will know what he did here." Elara wiped at her eyes, her heart heavy but resolute. "He deserves that." The team made their way back to their ship, the journey feeling longer without Thomas's presence to lead them. The weight of his absence settled into the quiet spaces between their conversations, and though they moved with purpose, each of them carried their grief in their own way. When they finally boarded the ship, the reality of their success, and their loss, fully hit them. Elara sat in the control room, staring out at the horizon as the ship lifted off. She could feel the magic of the land fading behind them, slowly but surely being contained by the ritual Thomas had completed. He had done it. He had saved them all. As the ship sailed through the clouds, Lyra approached, standing beside Elara in silence. They both looked out at the distant continent, now a speck on the horizon. "He did it," Lyra said quietly. "He gave us a future." Elara nodded, though the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. "He did. But it's hard to feel like we won when we lost him." Lyra placed a hand on Elara's shoulder, offering comfort in the only way she knew how. "We'll make sure the world knows what he did. That's how we honor him." As the ship sailed farther away from the forgotten continent, the team remained silent, each lost in their thoughts. They had completed their mission. The magic had been sealed, and the land would be safe once more. But the victory felt hollow, weighed down by the memory of the man who had made it all possible. In the weeks that followed, the story of Thomas's sacrifice spread. Tales of the explorer who ventured into the forgotten continent and gave his life to seal away an ancient magic were told in hushed tones around campfires and in taverns. People spoke of the cursed land, now freed from its dark past, and of the man who had become its eternal guardian. Elara, Marcus, and Lyra continued their work, each of them forever changed by what they had experienced. They moved on, as all people must, but they never forgot. Thomas had saved them, and his legacy lived on in their hearts and in the stories they told. In the end, Thomas had become more than just a man. He had become a symbol of sacrifice, of courage, and of hope. And though his name would eventually fade into legend, the land he saved would remain, forever marked by his selfless act. The forgotten continent was no longer forgotten. It had been remembered, not just in history, but in the hearts of those who knew the truth. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all.